Oh, hi there. So nice to see so many people joined us today. What a nice thing to do for a coffee break, right? I'm Now by the way, and I'm happy to introduce the second webinar of the HART series that is being hosted here at SoftBank Robotics Europe. You will hear about concrete solutions for more responsible practices in robotics and artificial intelligence. So, I'll let the floor to our moderator, Susanna, to tell you more about it. Have fun.
Thank you, Now. I'm very excited to welcome you all in our second HART webinar, where we will discuss responsible robotics and AI. We believe technology will benefit humanity to overcome some crucial social and environmental issues. However, as much as technology is leading us to a better future, it is also poses significant and unprecedented risks that we must start talking about. So that's why today we're going to discuss some ethical and legal dilemmas brought by robotics and AI technology. And we're going to try to concentrate on the solutions, for example, regarding safety, transparency, bias and fairness, and some engineering and UX best practices. We'd love to hear from you during the webinar, so please don't hesitate to give us your questions using the chat in the bottom, and we'll be answering these questions at the end. Finally, let me introduce and welcome our speakers, Daniel, Joanna, and Olivier. Hello.
Hello, everybody.
So I'll start with our first speaker, Daniel Mcduff. So he's a principal researcher at Microsoft Research in Redmond, and his research is at the intersection between psychology and computer science. He is designing hardware and algorithms for sensing human behavior at scale. Previously, he was also the director of research at MIT Media Lab spin-off Affectiva. So Daniel, being a leading researcher in the field of affective computing, can you share with us the greatest ethical challenge in this new field, and how are you addressing them at work?
Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so in the field of affective computing, which is in many ways a very broad and cross-disciplinary field that captures research from developing novel sensors, wearable sensors, and other types of electronics and hardware, to computer vision algorithms, to developing user interfaces and intelligent interactions. There are many challenges that come up when thinking about how this can be deployed. My biggest concern at the moment is that affective signals about how people express themselves, that may signal how they feel, might be used as a shortcut in supposedly intelligent systems to try to characterize people in a way that isn't accurate or equitable or responsible. And this is, of course, particularly problematic if it's used to restrict opportunities or disadvantage people, which is a general problem when deferring decision-making to machines without some human oversight. But in the case of affective computing in particular, I think it's dangerous because people, I think, often think that if you can measure emotion, then or something correlated with emotion, then you're tapping in directly to some truth of what people experience. But that's rarely the case. It's much more complicated than that. And so in order to avoid this, our approach is to frame the technology much more as an aid to individuals in a way that they consent to and can benefit from. We think about the whole system end to end, everything from the psychology theories about how people express themselves and how emotions manifest in terms of physiological changes, and right the way through to how this is surfaced in the user interface and used to make decisions that affect the person who's using the system. We hope that our methods approaching the research in this way can influence both industry and the research community. And we're very transparent about how we work on this. And doesn't mean that we've solved all of these challenges. That's one of the things about developing new technology, is you're constantly discovering new ways it can impact people and society. And we're trying to stay ahead of that, not rushing into creating technology that could be harmful, but anticipating those challenges and addressing them ahead of time.
Right, yeah, I think we'll cover a bit also the engineering best practices that you're doing at Microsoft later on the webinar, but that's already a very good insight of your work. So our second speaker, it's Joanna Bryson, which is a professor of ethics and technology and a founding member of the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. Her current research focuses on the impact of this technology on human societies and also new models of governance for digital technology and AI. She's also one of the experts on responsible use of artificial intelligence for the Global Partnership on AI, which is an OECD initiative. So Joanna, can you tell us more about the Global Partnership on AI, where you are now the co-chair of the governance committee?
Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction. I'm afraid I'm going to correct a couple things. Hertie School is much older than me. Not much older, actually. Actually, it's younger than me, but it was founded in this century, but I only have arrived this past year, but I was one of the founding members of the Center for Digital Governance. But before that, yes, I have been doing artificial intelligence since the 80s, actually. But I had a PhD in 2001 from MIT in the AI lab, the sworn enemy of the Media Lab. And although now the Media Lab is still there and the AI lab is gone, so I guess the Media Lab won. Anyway, so coming back to the Global Partnership for Artificial Intelligence, this was set up by, it's a weird geopolitical entity that was set up by originally by members of the G7. But there's a lot of nations that are members of it now. There's some nations that would like to be members and have not been accepted. I'm not part of that decision process, but we are, there's some really amazing experts that are being presented from the different countries, and I've been brought in by Germany. And I'd only been here 6 months and they made me one of their 9 experts. And I'm in the research group for, well, they called it responsible AI. And immediately the first thing we did at the first meeting was change the name to responsible development and use of AI to make it clear that it is not the machine that is ever, there's no way to enforce responsibility on a machine or to penalize it in a way that would alter its behavior if it did something wrong. So the idea of responsibility does not belong with AI itself, but rather it is always the responsibility of either the developers or hopefully, if it's been correctly developed, of the owner-operators that you're seeing expressed. So when we talk about transparency, we're talking about actually helping corporations demonstrate that they followed good practice and that indeed the problems are the problems of the owner-operators, not the problems that go back to poor design. Although I totally agree with Daniel that this, some people think AI is magic and will know what the problems are going to be in the future. No, there is no magic. We keep getting smarter and smarter, and as we get smarter and smarter, we're capable of more and more. So there's more and more things that can go wrong too. So we will always be working on trying to find ways to govern, which govern just means being able to regulate so that you are able to perpetuate into the future. So keeping our societies together, keeping our corporations together, keeping up, every entity has to be self-regulatory, but we use governments to sort of help us reduce the burdens that individuals would have otherwise to get everything done. So to build, for example, shared infrastructure. So anyway, the problems of the Global Partnership for AI are indeed these questions about, well, what can national governments do? Because some of that global infrastructure has become giant corporations such as Microsoft, who are providing enormous services through their cybersecurity and things like that, but are still private entities. So we have to come to a new understanding. And yeah, I think I've probably taken my turn, but I'm happy to answer more questions.
Great, and yeah, just about that, we were talking about the role of the government, and you recently participated on the consultation on the white paper for artificial intelligence. Oh. And so if you want to share with us a bit the main takeaways on that consultation paper.
I actually thought, so this is the for the European Union, and so first of all, you have to say, well, who cares? Well, obviously the people in the European Union, and maybe some people like really near the European Union across a little bit of water may care about what the European Union does. But also globally, the European Union demonstrated through the General Data Privacy Regulation that when a large enough group of rich enough customers expresses its will about adequate protections of their citizens, then people will respect that. And so, so now it's really interesting because the European Union is looking to say, well, is there anything we need to do more than, and notice the GDPR did not only defend the privacy of Europeans, individuals, it also made it much easier to do digital service and digital economy within Europe. So it also, most of the legislation was about making it easier to work with us, but it also drew some borders, and that's what made the headlines, right? Well, anyway, so now we're looking and saying, what do we need to do beyond that? So the European Union's white paper on artificial intelligence was a bunch of suggestions. And then there's also this Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, which we've just gotten draft versions of that too. So we expect towards the end of February, early March, we'll also have another piece of legislation which is specific to AI. So having said all that, most of it was really nice. It made these points that I was trying to make earlier about the fact that you can go back and demonstrate due diligence, like what kind of regulatory bodies do we need to support that so that we can help check that, and how can we cooperate. My commentary, which is available online, I'll paste it when my turn is over, is I was a little worried because there were a couple of things that were strange. And since I've written it, I've learned more about this. So one thing which is actually a really good idea is a risk-based approach. It doesn't make sense that a company that's just making a little toy has to worry as much as a company that, say, provides cybersecure email, right? So those are two different kinds of use cases. However, one little toy, it turned out that you could sit there and like kittens, and all of a sudden your democracy might be compromised. So we always have to look, and we can't just draw a clear line. And while the white paper said, well, yes, there's high risk and low risk AI. And again, nobody at the table, actually. I was once at a meeting very recently with someone from Google that said, let me tell you what high risk AI is. It's machine learning that's less than a new machine learning algorithm, less than 18 months old. And I'm like, no, liking kittens was years old when it became dangerous. So we need to, so it turns out that risk-based governance is really, really sensible. But unfortunately, projecting it as a binary or even like a ladder is not really, that's not the legal mechanism that makes sense. And now I'm not a lawyer, but Karen Young of Birmingham has done some really great writing about this. So if you want to go look up what's going on with this, that's my main lead. Similarly, there was this weird line in the parliament that AI makes things opaque. It doesn't have to make things opaque. It's a digital technology. We now have an opportunity to make things more transparent than they've ever been, which I think is one of the things people get nervous about. So some people used to hide behind clouds of like saying, oh, nobody can understand this, but if you want the good toys, you have to accept this opaqueness. And I think we're making it clearer now that even if you don't understand every little weight in a neural network, that's not what understanding means. It's, as we were talking about before, making sure that people are delivering their software in a safe way and that they've done adequate testing, and that should be auditable. And it doesn't have to be open sourced. It just means that there ought to be a way to go through and see and be able to defend yourself from liability by showing that you've done your work correctly and keeping records. I mean, you're a manufacturing company at SoftBank. You must have massive amounts of information about what were the design decisions, what were the cost benefit, you know, when was it tested, how do you know it's physically safe? And robotics is probably relatively well regulated. But if you compare that to, for example, social media or search or these new sectors, which just don't have regulation yet, there's still more confusion about liability in those sectors.
Right. So you made a good point talking about SoftBank Robotics, because today we also have as a third speaker, Olivier Guillem, which is our legal and risk director of Robotics Europe for 9 years today. He's also the co-author of 3 books about the relationship between AI and robots and the legal ethical challenges raised by these technologies. So Olivier, I wanted to ask you, where has been the biggest challenges at SoftBank Robotics regarding the use of our technology with our robots and also the algorithms we put in our robots?
Great, thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. John, I share most of your concern, but I think we will have the opportunity to talk about that later. About the challenge we have to face, in fact, we have to face a lot of challenge. I will just pick some as general description of the challenge we used to, or we have to face in the past. First challenge is literally strange word. It's the science fiction. Why? Because in fact, we are making humanoid, we are developing humanoid robots, and we all have imagination and fantasy in regard of those products. So we are all imagining what a humanoid robot can do. And when you start developing it, it's like the AI, which is embedded. You face reality, and you quickly realize that reality and fantasy is not really matching. When you start selling it on large scale, that means quickly your customer might be deceived, because the performance of the robot, the performance of the AI may be under the expectation of your customer. So the first approach we had is to try to be very pedagogical, and very humble, and try to educate and try to really say the truth about the performance of the product, not overselling it. I would say the second very big challenge, related to our product was the human factor. It's a humanoid robot, so necessarily it has the shape of a human. That makes sense. However, because it has a human shape, you are comparing our product to a human. And when you make a comparison, you automatically think that this robot is trying to compete me, or this robot is trying to replace me. So one of the often question we have is, does your intention is to replace us? You want to take our job, and so on. So the idea we got to try to avoid this issue is to start developing applications which are good for humanity. So that means we willingly try to avoid certain development. This has a cost for the company, but we thought that it was the best way to promote our product and to promote the humanoid robotics. And probably I can finish with this example, because maybe I spoke already too much, but is the social acceptation. No one wants a product spying you. No one wants to spy at home, right? So that's mean we took the position of, contrary to certain big firm, to limit the number of data collected. We do not try to maximize the collection of data, of few personal data. So maybe it's I'm answering directly, Joanna, to one of the points you raised, and that's why I say I absolutely share your concern, and here we share your concern. I think it's not necessity to collect all what you can do. What is necessary is you should be modest in your collection and collect only what you need. And what you need, you should clearly state. You should really mention your intention in advance, and to be transparent to your customer. So here also, this has a cost, because it means you probably refuse to monetize certain data. So it's a source of revenue that you're missing. But it's also the best way to ensure that your product, AI in general, is accepted by the public. And my today concern and big challenge, but I think we'll have the opportunity again to discuss about that today later, is the liability of the different player. Because I think today law is a little bit weak on this point. I'm making a teasing here, and I think I keep that for later for the discussion today.
Thanks, Olivier. But you're actually touching a very important point, which was actually on the continuity of this panel today. And yeah, the question was directed to you and Joanna, and also Daniel, if you want to jump in, about the current laws that allow the responsibilities to the manufacturers, the distributors, and the consumers today. How does it work today? And should that change? And why or how should that change?
Okay. Joanna, you want to start? Yeah, please go ahead.
No, I'd love to hear what you were going to say, but I'm
okay. Yeah, today I will speak about the liability, if you don't mind. Today we have in Europe a European directive. This directive is from 1985. So it's pretty old. I just say that it's pretty old in regards of the artificial intelligence. And I say that to say that, of course, we understand that it's not perfect. It's not perfect because at that time, probably all the potential issue related to artificial intelligence was not really here. So we cannot blame this directive. This directive have been, of course, in France, but everywhere in Europe, we have to follow this directive about product liability. And if we look more in detail about the application of this product liability directive, it happened that today there is absolutely no difference between AI, a robot, and any other good, such as a blender that I love to compare. So today we have the same disposition applying for AI and a blender. I have nothing against blender as principle. However, it's not really considering the specificity of the AI. So we can imagine many specificity, but regarding the applicable law, what is not considered the interactivity, the learning capacity, and the decision-making autonomy, kind of autonomy, which is absolutely not considered today on the legal point of view. So that's mean, for example, as our company, SoftBank Robotics Europe, as a producer of robot embedding artificial intelligence, okay, we are liable for all the liability of the value chain, and some player does not share this liability. So if I have a wish is to have ethic AI, everybody needs to be liable. Everybody needs to share a part of the risk. And today it's not the case. Today it's absolutely not the case. This is concerning the player, but also concerning the damage. It's funny to consider that we are in a data environment, data world, but if you have a data damage, today it's not covered. What is covered is physical risk, injury, but not if you have any, if you lose your data, if your data are compromised. Today it's absolutely excluded from the possibility of indemnification of the product liability directive that we mentioned earlier. So in summary, you have a part of the player who are not liable, and also it's not covering all the possible damages. So necessarily, my wish is to have a modification of the current law, expecting that all the player could be involved and that all the possible damages could be covered. And when I say the player, is also the user. When we spoke about interactivity, learning capacity, we understand that today a user of artificial intelligence can also influence the behavior kind of the artificial intelligence, And those persons are totally not considered in the scope of the product liability. Yeah. I don't know if I answered to all the question, but we can start like that.
Yeah, I believe Joanna wanted to react to that question too.
Now I'm super curious about what Microsoft thinks, but I don't know if Daniel wants to represent that, or if you want me to go.
I won't speak for the whole company, but from my perspective, I think what you said earlier, Joanna, about increasing transparency is really relevant here, right? We have this opportunity to potentially in decision-making systems increase transparency, and in my work I see the signals that kind of I work with being used in decision-making systems in a way that doesn't do that across when I look at all the products on the market as well as it could, and so we're at this maybe you could say tipping point of it would be great if we can design ways such that as we develop new technology that can extract more information about the world, that it can be used to drive decision-making systems that are more transparent rather than less. Because in the past, of course, there were decision-making systems that were inequitable. But they were mostly human decision-making systems, and so it was very hard to think of a way to make them more transparent while keeping them efficient, right? It's just very hard to have a distributed system where you can have complete transparency. But in a digital world, there are opportunities there, but we need to be proactive to take advantage of them. So yeah, that's what I see as the hope that we have here is that this technology can ultimately make things fairer and more transparent, but it's not going to happen by default.
Right. Okay. So yeah, because Microsoft, that is well aligned to what I've heard Microsoft saying recently. Although I slightly better, so I love it. but yeah, it's great. But they didn't used to say that. Like 5 or 10 years ago, they were some of the people that would helicopter into regulatory things and say, if you try to regulate us, you're going to lose deep learning, and then all the toys are going away. And then they just changed. They changed their mind. They put out their principles, and they said, no, we get it. We care about accountability, transparency. We care about being human-centered. And so to what Olivier was saying before, when we say about spreading it out, the responsibility to everyone, one of the things I was thinking about was, are we spreading also the profits out to everyone? but because that is another big consideration of mine, is about underregulated industries, and this is not robotics, incidentally. I know it's hard to make a robot company, but that one of the mechanisms by which you can recognize underregulation is enormously large market capitalization, which is of course something also SoftBank has. Anyway, sorry, I have gotten myself down a hole. Let's go back to liability. So there's corporate liability, and then there is user liability. And we can look at this in the automobile industry. So in the automobile industry, every single car that's been produced for like a decade has at least some AI in it. So it's completely false that you can't regulate AI. We've been regulating the automobile industry for a while. And once in a while, someone gets killed. And I don't just mean by driverless cars, although even there, those are incredibly sophisticated, and we all see in the headlines within a couple of days exactly what the machine saw and what it thought, the decision processes. So that stuff can be kept transparent. We can keep records of even AI that you might want to call autonomous. But the important thing, the case I was thinking about, which has gone through the German courts, was this consideration of a person who was basically on cruise control with a stroke. And the car was making sure that they weren't asleep, because that's really bad if you're in cruise control and you're asleep, but their eyes were open and their hands were on the steering wheel. And so the car kept going, and it killed a bunch of people. And the German prosecutors went to the automobile manufacturer and saw that all this diligence had been taken to show that, that they thought of everything that anyone had ever thought of. This was just an incredibly horrible accident. And so there was no case prosecuted, which means we can't cite the case, unfortunately. but the experts who were involved in this have published it, and you can find papers about this. So basically, when you have a product, that's what manufacturer's liability is. And of course, you have to draw these lines and figure out when is you need to be able to show that you made it, that it was safe, it to the best of your knowledge, it was secure. And then we can impute either that it was, what Americans would call an act of God. It was just something that was out of control, or it really was a user deliberately doing something wrong. And that's the thing that we need to be able to document and present in court. The most important thing is when you're saying everyone, you do not include the robots, because again, what I worry about is the people, and there are definitely people that say, oh, you don't understand autonomy. I've put a random number generator into my Twitter bot, and I'm therefore no longer liable for what it says. That was literally what somebody said, a Dutch researcher who created Twitter bots that issued a death threat and then got in trouble with the Dutch police for having issued a death threat. And the point is that we can't allow people to get out of their obligations to society by putting random number generators in their robots, or by throwing away their records of why they developed the system the way they did, or by creating an unnecessarily complicated system. You don't want to motivate that. What you do want to motivate is having a system you can maintain, that's clean, that's clear, that you know is the safest thing that you could make. And so, well, I agree that, just like with a gun or whatever, that, and then people push this, with private airplanes and guns have been big issues about who's liable, given the nature of the product. But by and large, and I'm not saying that law is simple, but by and large, we're at some kind of a sensible equilibrium between what was something that the user intentionally did with a product that was designed to have that affordance, and that was their choice, and they as an adult human is the one who's liable, or did the product, was it in a deceptive way? And again, with anthropomorphism, you can see that, like, it's like, well, but the robot said it was okay, and that you wouldn't have believed that if it was even the telephone, right? If there's somebody else on the telephone, another human, you'd say, oh, they're not in the room, they don't know as much. But with a robot, we have demonstrations that people will ignore a knowledgeable human and listen to a robot that is giving misinformation, because people trust robots more than other people in some contexts. So it is very, very hard, especially if you're going to anthropomorphize your robots, to make it clear. And given that we now know that scientifically, it creates a new kind of challenge. So I guess I would disagree, though, that the one thing about the European law is it hasn't been clear enough yet that artificial intelligence is a product. And in particular, there are certain, again, not SoftBank so much, but certain people are selling software, or not even selling, giving away access to software for free, bartering data, and then claiming that they're providing a service, not a product. And my argument is that the product is providing a service, but that product still has product liability. And that's something that is not yet clear in the white paper. So I hope that's the direction we're going to go with this. And I'm interested, I would love to hear Olivier say a little more clear, if when he said not all the actors are taking responsibility, if there was some other people in the tech sector that he thought weren't getting as much liability as they should within his development process.
So to bring an insight, and I think we have also a question on the chat about that, about the direction. Of course, I'm not an expert about EU law, and I do not exactly what will happen in the future. But however, we have recently we got 3 resolutions from the European Parliament. These 3 resolutions are very recent. They are from I think October last year, October 20. And one of the resolution was about IP. The second one was about ethics, and the last one was about liability. And the interesting one that we are today discussing about is liability. This last one tried to create a special liability for AI. So this is very interesting because firstly, it means that the European Parliament understands that there is a weakness in current legislation, in current law. And this is also shared by the European Commission. Earlier in a year, I mean, last year, it was in February last year, we got a white book. In the white book made by the European Commission, they also share the point that there is a need to make our law change to consider the rise of the artificial intelligence. And to come back on the resolution, what is written on the resolution, it's mentioned that we need a special, I do not really share the view, but what is interesting is to say that we need a special liability for the player of the artificial intelligence. And they consider that we should keep the product liability as it is. And above that, or on the side of that, we should have another type of liability dedicated to the artificial intelligence. And they don't care if it's a big player or a small player. They don't care if you are also manufacturing a good, a tangible good, I would say, or not. They just care about the risk, the level of risk. And it's quite easy on the paper. You have the artificial intelligence with high risk and the other one. And they consider that if you are in a high risk, then you should be objectively liable. That means even if you have no fault or whatever, you should be liable. That's the way today suggested by the European Parliament. Where I see there is a weakness, first, it's an addition. That means we have the product liability and we will have that on the side. So it's a source of confusion. I would have preferred that we have an evolution of the product liability legal system. That's first things. And second, there is a cap of the liability within the resolution. That means the developer, for example, of AI will have its liability limited, for example, to 2 million euros. Why? We once again, as a SoftBank Robotics Europe, we are manufacturing tangible goods such as robots, but we are also developing AI. So we are on both sides. So I just mentioned that to say that I try to be neutral, but I don't understand why, as a robot manufacturer, my liability is not limited, and why, as a AI developer, my liability should be limited. And limiting the liability means limiting the trust in AR technology. And I think all of us as a player of AI, we should give trust to the public. We should give trust in this technology. And this trust, the best way is not to limit. The best way to achieve it, it's not to limit our liability. It's to fully indemnify if there is any damage, and it's to act in full transparency. Yeah, sorry to have been. Also to answer the different question we can see popping out on the chat.
Thank you.
Can I come back quickly?
Yeah, okay, just a few more, and then maybe we'll move on to another topic.
Yeah, I'm sorry for all the people who thought that they were going to hear other things about responsible use of AI, but this is a really, really big deal. And I just wanted to say very quickly that it's a little, okay, that a few years ago, the European Parliament put out this idea that it should be possible to make an autonomous system entirely itself liable. And that was an effort to basically cap liability. And I believe that probably came from the car manufacturers. And the situation was that basically Apple and Google had both announced driverless cars, and that they would happily be liable. Now, they both have more money reserves than they can legally spend. Again, it's an indication of being underregulated. So for them, taking on their own liability is just fundamentally different than for a manufacturer who typically has, like, relatively thin margins to do that. And so on the one hand, I absolutely agree that Europe needs to think about ways to spread liability around, like that governments may want to encourage the artificial intelligence experimentation and do that through some kind of liability pools. At the same time, I'm very worried. I don't want to encourage reckless use of AI. And I certainly, it does not make a sense. So we wrote a big paper with a couple of lawyers about you cannot make the AI itself liable for itself. You're basically then motivating manufacturers to take part of their business process and say, oh, let's just take all the humans out of it, no human jobs. And then we have both tax and legal liabilities capped. So it's very, very important that that yes, we need to think about what the extra risks are if we want to promote certain kinds of applications of AI and how we can absorb them. But making the machines themselves liable makes no sense whatsoever. It is just a way of saying, it's basically a way of giving it back to the taxpayers again. And if we're going to do it to the taxpayers, let's do it more transparently and just say, okay, we've set up this fund and let's do that.
Thanks a lot for that insight too on liability, and maybe moving forward, but still it's in this topic of liability, I would like to tackle one example. And this question is a bit more for Daniel, but also if you want to jump in, Joanna and Olivier. And it's about the sophisticated fake videos that we know as deepfakes that today are getting more and more advanced and that have serious implications on governments and businesses. And my question to Daniel was, what are the technical solutions that we have today to fight against them? And what can companies and governments do about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And in many ways, it touches on the broader question of how people are made aware or not that what they're seeing, the content or the experience that they have is generated by a machine or by a human. And this is maybe one very present example of that. And while it's hard to come up with very generalizable principles in many cases, I think there is a very strong argument for a core principle that in systems we build, people should be made aware of whether they're interacting with a machine or a human being. So that can be a technical solution in the sense that that's how the system is designed, so how it's implemented and how people interact with it. There are other technical solutions and people working in the machine learning community to detect fake videos using algorithms and to provide ways to watermark things in order to make them identifiable and other things. But I think ultimately this will be more successfully addressed at the system level when we think about how we design things that people interact with, and ultimately it will need to be something that can to some extent have the sort of infrastructure around it that Joanna mentioned, the regulation to help promote that so that we can get standardization. But at the moment, or in the last few years, it certainly has been a bit of a wild west of people can create anything and distribute it, and they have the platforms and the reach to do so, and that needs to change. One thing I will mention is an initiative that I've been working on with a few people from industry and academia, where our goal is to help people have a greater ability to restrict use cases of what they build. For example, at the moment, if a student or an academic open sources their code or models, they in many cases give up almost all of their control with regard to how they're used. Now, big companies like Microsoft can have lawyers to define end user license agreements and decide how their customers can or cannot use the technology they're providing to them. But in many cases, a lot of the innovation we see is coming from academia, from people that maybe they don't always have the ability to restrict the things that they distribute, how they're used. So we're trying to find ways to enable people to have more power to do so. For instance, a student may be developing an algorithm that could then be repurposed and used by a bad actor in a bad way. Can we give people more power to restrict how their technology is used. And that's a responsible AI licensing initiative that we've been working on, which kind of touches on this topic.
So can I ask a question about that too? I haven't heard about this particular approach. One of the things that really, as I mentioned, I'm one of the founders of the Center for Digital Governance at Hardy School. One of the things that really strikes me about the digital, and that I don't think people understand well enough, is that it changes on a dime. And especially, you can't tell from my accent, I actually hold 2 passports, British and American. And both of those, I got the British one specifically so I would have an EU passport. And one of the things that happens is those 2 countries had according to the WHO, the world's best preparation for pandemic. Their plans, they had rehearsed the plans, they had these great plans, and then they elected governments that just chose not to use them. And I think digital, so it's not just about digital, but when you have a digital asset, when you have data, when you have these capacities, somebody else owns it, and all of a sudden things change, right? How it's deployed, whether you trust your government with certain kinds of data, you have to recognize there could be another government. There could be a coup. There could be just a democratic change of government, and people might just use that data differently. And so I think I'd be astounded. It's great to do that as much as you can, but I don't want to give people a false sense of security. I think we need to recognize, well, first of all, that we have to, that the government matters, and we need to invest effort in making sure that the people who are enforcing the law are themselves reliable, and that takes vigilance. But if we can find technological solutions, then that's great. But I just have to admit I'm skeptical. So could you say a little bit more about how that works?
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think there are multiple levels to this. Our initiative is really just to address one portion of this, what we see as a potential problem, where in science, we want to be able to distribute things so that people can build on what we do. And in computer science in particular, there's been, in many ways, a good tradition of being very open, but we're recognizing now, I think, that comes with challenges. So if you distribute a model that can be used to classify something about a person, and someone comes along and takes that model, maybe without fully understanding its limitations or drawbacks, and deploys it on a population, that could have negative consequences. And because of, as you say, because of things can change on a dime, that it's harder now, I would argue, to anticipate those negative use cases. So we want to give, particularly in our case, people who may not have all of the legal resources of large companies or governments to restrict or limit how people can use what they build if they're not sure about what the negative implications of deploying it in a certain way might be. So just be more cautious, essentially. And that hopefully will allow people to share ideas without as much risk of them being used by bad actors. But it doesn't solve, I mean, it only solves a small portion of the larger problem, which, as you say, needs to come from multiple levels, at a government level, at a societal level, of deciding what we want our norms to be in terms of how people, how these systems are used in society, and yeah, lots of different levels, and ours is just addressing one particular.
So if I could just ask really quickly, like I could see how this would work with legitimate corporate products. So like the GDPR, we could go in and say, oh, you can't use that because it's against its certification, so you can't use it that way. But I'm wondering if you're, in terms of enforcement, Microsoft not only does Word or whatever, but it also does quite a lot of the infrastructure, communicative infrastructure. So would you actually be looking for violations within your networking systems and just pulling the plug on people that are misusing software? Or are you thinking about Microsoft as an enforcer, or are you expecting governments to do the enforcement?
In a way, Microsoft already does that. They have, a lot of the, we have systems in place now where AI technology, if a customer comes along with a use case, that is reviewed by a responsible AI committee. It's decided about whether we need to put specific, rules in place in terms of that agreement as to how it can be used and limitations and things like that. So, and Microsoft has the ability to, has a lot of resources to be able to do that, and sort of, in a sense, it has the resources to act responsibly. But in other cases, people want to do more, but they may not have the mechanism to do more without just keeping things closed. So this particular initiative is not so much to help Microsoft, but really to help startups or academics who want to deploy things, release things, but are worried about how a bad actor could come along and use those.
No, I fully get that. And it's totally true that people are sometimes saying the patent system is useless anymore. You cannot, protect IP unless you are really huge, which is not entirely true. Sometimes people win. But anyway, the point is that I was trying to get at was that once you have the certification of responsible use, then who does the enforcement? And so even if it is as you say, it can't be the college student who wrote the software, or the high school student that wrote the software, or even some of the SMEs don't have the resources to enforce that. So is it going to be that you expect that the EU will enforce it, or do you expect that whoever like Microsoft would say, if you use our software libraries, we'll just shut it down. So if you link to us, then we can make sure that the certification is being met.
Yeah, I'd love to know Olivier's point of view on this, because I'm not a legal expert. Okay. I'd love to see it on all levels, that Microsoft takes responsibility as well as government.
Okay. Maybe two things. One about what is currently ongoing, about still on the side of the EU. We earlier spoke about you remember the resolution which have just been taken by the European Parliament on October 20 last year. And we mentioned that one of these 3 resolutions was dedicated to the ethics, right? And it seemed that one of the approach, I should say that the resolution have no power, no capacity to be enforced, is just for the Parliament to express what is its opinion, and its push and requesting the European Commission to react and to take probably in consideration the position of the Parliament. So to come back on the topic, is just one of the idea was to create an ethics committee, and this ethics committee was supposed to give a certificate if you are able to demonstrate that you respect certain ethics criteria. So about the ethics criteria, there is a lot in the resolution, but roughly it's a copy and paste of the work of the expert of high level in AI, which work in I think they give a result of their work in 2018. April 18, about AI, human-centric, under the control of human, with data governance, and so on. There is 7 recommendations, 7 key principles to respect, and those recommendations have been duplicated in the resolution. So we could say that it seems to be the way appearing, not sure, but appearing today to have a future EU resolution. After, and I quite agree with you, Daniel, this is not really responding about how the developer or the publisher will really use, how the AI which have been developed will be used. And it seems that today there is not, except in big groups such as Microsoft, a question. There are no wondering about what could happen if suddenly I release this AI for the public in open source. And I think we have the case of the deepfake, which are using AI which have been made open source, and certain use are very questionable. I could. So one of my is very personal. One of my very personal approach was, why not considering AI as not as the other software, but as active substance, I could say, a bit like a drug. When you try to put on the market a new drug, okay, you do an assessment before to do it. This obliges you to question yourself about the good and the positive and negative effects, okay? And you do this risk assessment, this impact study before releasing it. And I think we should be pushed in that way to consider that AI is not just a simple software. It's this active substance, a bit like a drug, which need before to be put on the market to be assessed. And this idea of impact study is not really new. We can find it in GDPR for biometric data. When you want to use biometric data in AI, for example, you are obliged to do an impact study. So it's a tool, but the idea is to generalize the use of this tool before to release it to the public. That's one of the suggestions, maybe to find a good way to at least to handle a little bit more properly the usage of the AI.
And Olivier, there you touch a very important point about the engineering best practices and also actually UX best practices for the use of our technology and robotics. But I would like to ask one more question before starting to ask the questions of the public. And it's about, I personally believe that there's importance in education of our researchers and the students. As Daniel was saying, they were also releasing sometimes open source projects. And yeah, the three of you, what kind of training do you think is important today, and what changes can we do in the educational level? Because I think it's not only about regulation, but also about education. And what can we do about that today?
I think, I mean, it all comes back to, for me, is having a broader education. If you have a siloed education where you just study, for instance, how to build machine learning models, how to train algorithms, how to optimize them, but not think about, you know, how that system might be deployed in society, how it might affect people, maybe the psychology behind how people interpret, as Olivier was saying, what the capabilities of a humanoid robot versus a computer box that you have under your desk. The differences between how people perceive those things. I think we need more and more sort of opportunities for people to learn broadly across those, and I think we are thankfully starting to change in terms of the machine learning community, so that the academic conferences are starting to have more of this type of discussion, but it's still not enough, and it takes a long time to change academic communities. They're often very staid, and we don't want to go out of our comfort zone. But we need to bring people in from other disciplines, from ethics, from design, human-computer interaction, psychology. We need to bring those people in to help, you know, both those people who are very advanced, who are, you know, have PhDs, are doing research professionally, as well as students who are doing undergraduate degrees or even in school. And yeah, the more we can encourage that, I think the better.
Yeah, if I can come in on that, I spent I don't know, 15, 17, something like that years teaching in a computer science department before I came to the Hardy School. We had, the British are actually sort of forward-looking about this, so we had some requirements about how much ethics we taught and things like that. But what I realized, I was actually asked to speak again in London to an architect group. And I realized that architecture undergraduates not only learn how to be architects, which is a big and dangerous, important thing. They build things that you don't want to have fall on you. But they also then go forward to get licensed, right? And then not only are the architects themselves licensed, but I mean, all the trainees or whatever, also then the buildings are, they're inspected, you have to get planning permission. There's all these different levels of regulation that we now take for granted in urban planning and in constructing a building and bridges and things like that. It didn't used to be that way. It used to be with enough money, you could just build anything. And eventually we required that this stuff happen because we care about human life. And basically, I think that software is getting to that stage now where we have suddenly started really altering the planet in ways even larger than a single building falling down on, killing hundreds of people. So we need to be really expecting to be professionalized. And but I say that, a lot of people say, oh, we need Hippocratic oaths for developers. And while I think it's wonderful that you don't think that it's the robot that's doing it, rather you think that you understand that the robot was built, you don't have a one-to-one relationship between you and some programmer that works for SoftBank or Google or Microsoft or something. You have, it's much more like a bank or an architect firm, where so the organization has to have some kind of structural obligations, and then maybe within that there's also some individual who was evil or something and did something, maybe, but that's an organization that's got to track that down. So while I do support the idea that we need to add this into standard education and also to add licensing in and inspection, and I really liked that, again, I know I'm saying your name terribly badly, but Olivier's idea about the model of this as an active substance, so it needs like a drug. That is beautiful. I saw that Facebook proposed something kind of weird and I hadn't figured it out yet. I didn't get my head around it, but I think now I see this is, they were doing it less elegantly, what you just said. So maybe, and also they were probably doing it within their own personal sandbox, so that, as Facebook would. But anyway, but I think these are the kinds of structures, and yeah, we all, like, nobody goes into software because they like licensing and things like that. We were all libertarian kids that wanted to build like a new world or something. So I get why there's resistance, and of course there's a cost. But as I said, look at the amount of wealth that's being generated. We need to deploy some of that wealth back into creating the infrastructure that allows us to stabilize our society, right? So we need to stabilize our political system and, of course, our ecological system to tackle the crises of overconsumption of resources that we've been experiencing. So yeah, no, I think that's a great set of ideas.
Yeah, and
I also like the drug.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Oh, I just like to, I also love the drug analogy as well, because that's often, those trials are often about studying a specific population in a specific context, and it's those pieces that we need to bring in. It's very hard now to evaluate a model on its own in isolation, because it's part of a human system. And so yeah, I think that analogy is great for multiple reasons, because it brings in the context about how this is being deployed and the impact, and that is well defined and well thought through. You design a trial in many cases before before you've finished your development, because you've already thought through who this is for and why you're doing it, versus building something and then putting it out into the world and seeing what happens.
Yeah. And this is a way to share that liability again. So it still doesn't get the manufacturer entirely off the hook if they did something wrong, or even if they didn't knowingly do anything wrong. But it ameliorates, if it turned out that you did everything as best as you could and everything, we're open with the regulators, then the taxpayers should be more willing to accept some of the cost. And so I think that's why it's a nice model for that reason too, because then we already have precedents about the different stages of responsibility between, again, with drugs, some people abuse the drugs, and then the question of whether people should have realized they were going to abuse the drugs or not. So it opens up the pathway. I mean, this is my very first AI ethics paper I wrote in the 1990s, and it was called Just an Artifact, because the amount to which people think AI is some new, totally exceptional thing. I keep just trying to open the door and say, look, there is precedent for these kinds of changes, and we can go back and we can use, of course, there's some new things, but there's a lot of stuff that we can use. Nothing that we build is as complicated as each other. If we can, and we can't entirely, but to the extent that we can govern our societies, then we ought to be able to get on top of this stuff.
And yeah, about what you were saying, you mentioned also the ecological damages of that we need to address today. And we kind of didn't tackle it yet, but yeah, just maybe we can discuss about who is about the accountability of, for example, training big models. I'm thinking about you know, machine learning for language and these big models, and who is accountable for that, and what can a government do in that sense, and then Daniel, after that, what are the best practices and how do we tackle that part? So it's first Joanna and then Daniel.
Oh, okay, this is me first. Okay, yeah, no, okay, because actually one of the biggest language, I mean, we know that there's big language models in Google, but there's this very interesting thing that Microsoft has done with respect to another company called OpenAI. That's like some sort of like, it was sort of like a weird NGO something, but then they got $1 billion from Microsoft, but they aren't owned by Microsoft somehow. And now Microsoft has licensed their giant AI model as well. I think it's for yet more money. So there's a lot of people talking, and this is called GPT-3, is this big model. There's also this older one, GPT-2, guess what? Anyway, so the point is that there's all these controversies about, well, where does the data come from? Are we propagating are we perpetuating our society? Yes, we're perpetuating our society's bias. That's what society does. It's not surprising, but of course we can, using technology, try to get on top of that. But anyway, the ecological costs. But again, I don't want to just totally lay this at the feet of the tech sector. And this is one thing, I don't like the entire word digital tax. I think we need to be thinking transnationally about whenever a company, so petrochemical, aerospace, there's all kinds of things that can sell their merchandise all around the world, that can develop revenue all around the world. And we need to think about, okay, so then what is the appropriate level of infrastructure investment that has to happen where people are being affected? And what was just, I think it was Nature, like about a week and a half ago, there was a call by a serious climate scientist saying, when we're doing these economic evaluations, you know, when governments think about these things, you have to think about how do you make good the ecological damage of whatever your manufacturing process was too. And so that also needs to be factored into these costs. And again, the transnational, you know, like the whole planet suffers when one country burns, well, a very large amount of coal, right? That dust goes around the latitudes at least. And so these kinds of, and you know, global warming again. So redistributing the benefit that comes from this out to ameliorate the costs that come to this to the people that are bearing the cost, whether or not they got any of the benefit, is one of the things we need to figure out, and that requires global coordination, which is difficult. So someone's just taken the
Now we're just getting ready for our Q&A, but yeah, we'll let Daniel answer the question about the environmental impact and best practices.
Yeah, those are great points, and I think my thoughts here are sort of smaller scale, I'll admit, but as a research community, as engineers and scientists developing these models, we just need, very simply, better measures of assessing the quality of these algorithms. So it's not just about creating something that is as accurate as possible, you know, in terms of whether that's precision, recall, you know, whatever your metrics are for accuracy, which is traditionally what most papers have been judged on, and most models have been judged on. But thinking about, again, about the environmental cost, the societal impact, you know, it might be that a model that is less accurate may have benefits in these other dimensions, and we can't just think of it in very simplistically in this just sort of one-dimensional way. So practically speaking, as someone who's building these types of models, that comes into my thinking and the thinking of our teams is how do we assess these in a more holistic way, and part of that, of course, is the environmental impact of using a lot of electricity and training these big models, and part of it is in terms of how they're deployed and other things like that. But Joanna, I mean, addressed what I would say is a much larger and overarching question here about kind of ultimately the responsibility of it comes down to organizations, it comes down to governments to be responsible for those things. And Microsoft's taken a stand, which it's great to see that companies want to offset their and reduce and go carbon negative, but it's there are still many problems that we need to solve in this space.
Yeah, it's an interesting point how there's a trade-off between the accuracy we want to gain with some models, but also the impact this has on training large models and stuff. So it's a very good point, Daniel, in there. So now we're gonna pass to the questions that we received on the chat. So this is one of them, and then I'll let you decide who wants to tackle it. So with the tendency for corporations to keep source code secret, how does this impact your ability to regulate AI?
Maybe I can contribute. I don't think there is a direct link between having a code, source code as a secret or not. In fact, probably it would help to keep it secret rather than to make it open source. I don't say that because I'm employed by a company, but simply because it's easier to regulate the use as we discussed earlier. I think the best way, however, to regulate the AI is to regulate the data. The data is I could say, is the petrol of the AI, and if you can find a really good way to regulate it, as we start doing it with GDPR, I think you will have something very effective. Also, another way is to start to consider that AI is also bringing value. I mean, probably if we develop AI in US, AI in Russia, China, Europe, the AI will work differently because we have different culture, different backgrounds. So it's behind the AI, you have a potential, the value of, let's say, of a population, of territories, countries, and so on. So if you make understand the different player that they have to respect your value, you're also regulating the AI.
Yeah. So if I could jump in on that, this is one of the things I'm pretty passionate about. This is another time we can go back to the drug analogy. You know, the pharmaceutical industry has 10 times as much IP as ICT has, 10 times. And yet there is absolutely, everything is inspected. So you don't have to open source open sourcing your code is neither necessary nor sufficient for transparency. You know, dumping millions of lines or trillions of weights is not on the internet is not going to help anyone understand your software. So true transparency, as I said, is keeping track of the processes and communicating the processes that humans followed so that we can see if humans did the right thing. You can also look at software understanding, and again, that might be proportionate to the capacities of the corporation about trying to demonstrate how the software works. But yeah, no, it's fine for companies to maintain IP, but it is not fine for them to throw away the software and not allow government inspectors to check what they've done, which is what a lot of them do. And so if that happens, they should be whacked by the full liability because they can no longer defend themselves. And that's why I'm saying the most important thing is clarifying the lines of accountability and having enforcement so that the companies who are doing the right things, that are following good procedures, can prove it, and the ones that are doing the wrong things can get in trouble. I think that's got to be the goal. Yeah, and I have to say, I really disagree that we could, so I agreed with a bunch of things, but I gotta disagree with this thing that regulating data is sufficient. There is an awful lot of, I mean, machine learning is one way to do things, but machine learning doesn't just code itself. And data doesn't code itself, right? Somebody decided which data sets to use, which algorithms to use, has been tweaking the parameters, has been running the tests, and has been deciding about whether or not it comes out. And that's not even how all AI software is written. Some software is actually, you know, it's just written, it's just coded. So it's important to recognize both of these.
Okay, so now we have a bigger question. So I've been working on teaching new behaviors to robots using natural language. I've been asked several times how we should treat the case where a robot is taught by their owners an unethical behavior. In my opinion, it is clear the owner is responsible. What do the ethics guidelines say about that? And what does the law say about that? And by the owner, I meant the teacher. I don't know if the question was clear enough, or maybe I can sum up.
No, the question is clear. We're all just waiting for each other to answer it. Right now, I don't think the law is very clear about it, but I totally agree. And this is what I was trying to argue before. That my opinion, and it's this because I'm a libertarian programmer, I think we have to say there are going to be things that the owner can do and that then the owner is responsible for. So for example, if the owner makes a tweet bot that issues a death threat, that's the owner's problem. Now, but this is huge right now. You must know about sort of the cancel culture questions. Some people are saying, no, you cannot release software that allows owners to write tweet bots that issue death threats. And in doing that, like in creating the platform of Twitter or something, that you have therefore caused a problem that is a societal harm and you need to be, penalized somehow. So that is something that there isn't clear legal, as far as I know. But I leave it to the other two of you, if you know.
Just to go back to the drug analogy, sometimes people do things that without understanding the consequences or knowing what that they're doing might be bad for other people, right? So the reason that we have instructions on drug packaging is because I don't know how much to take. I don't know what to do with that substance unless I'm told. And so I think we also need the ability for people who are consuming this powerful technology. So maybe if you have a robot that's able to learn things from you, you need to be able to understand how to use that responsibly. And I don't think we've solved that question either, is how to, with these complex systems, is how to inform every end user about the potential impact of how it could be used. And in my discipline, I see that a lot. That there is, you can measure physiological changes in the body using wearable sensors. You can't map that directly to someone's emotional state, but a lot of people assume that you can, that you can do these simple mappings, but it's just not. It's much more complicated than that, and so there's this tension between trying to give people access to technology, make it as performant as possible, but then also you need to be able to educate and help them use it in a responsible way. So yeah, many questions. I don't have all the answers.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, I think the drug analogy is great here, and look at how we keep going to and fro about alcohol, pot, heroin, tobacco, and also now painkillers in America, but that they were and again, this is about, was the packaging honest? Were people unnecessarily promoted, were doctors unnecessarily promoted into using and prescribing addictive painkillers. So it's not easy, but the whole thing we can try to do is to make AI no harder, to start informing the public well, and not just the public, the judiciary. And like I said, in the past, there's been people that have been doing an awful lot of deceptive avoidance of regulation, just trying to stall off regulation. And I hope with the European actions of this year that we're going to get through that to the point where at least no worse than the drug industry. It'd be great if we actually improved on the drug industry, but hey.
Just to add one point, I agree with both of you. About the question we had just before, about the teacher. The teacher is not just the end user, of course. The teacher is also not only the developer, but it's also the one who is providing the database, which is supposed to be qualified and which will be used to learn to the machine. I mean, to the AI system. I say that just to make understand all people who are listening to us that teacher is much larger than one single person. It's a chain. It's a chain of user. It's a chain of player, and so it's really complicated. So in fact, the question is simple, but the answer is pretty difficult. What is sure is all of them should be concerned and should be liable. Certainly, in proportion of their risk they are taking. I mean, they are the risk which could be generated by their acts, we'll say.
Okay, so we still have a few more minutes for, I think, this last question until we wrap it up. So can we imagine new metrics for machine learning models that take ethics into account? For example, can we technically define and measure fairness?
Okay, I would love to do this question, or at least take a first cut. I put out a paper in Science in 2017 showing that artificial intelligence trained off of, or as we usually do, like off of language from the internet, has the same biases that humans do, these implicit biases. So for example, associating women's names more with domestic situations and male names more with career situations than the other way around. The interesting thing was once we had that in the AI, we could then go measure it, and we found out that these same, sexist word embeddings, that's what we call the semantics language, the same sexist AI actually accurately described what proportion of people that held a job. So the sexist thing to think is that, like a nurse is a female and a programmer is a male, right? But it turns out that only at that point, I was horrified by this. I love programming. I was a professional programmer. If you're a girl or you have a daughter, tell them programming is an awesome job. But anyway, there was only about 6% of programmers were female in the labor statistics of the time, like 2016 or so labor statistics. So it turns out that fairness is not well defined. We are arguing about this all the time. I just had another argument about this morning with another professor. Nature is not fair by itself. We're all different heights. Some of us have to spend 9 months to have a biological child, and some of us don't. There's some of us are born with no brain. I mean, that's just not fair, right? So fairness is something that we invent to try to make our society more inclusive and more powerful. Right, and it's an ongoing process. We're always trying to think of new ways to compensate for the unfairness that is the actual natural world. However, having said all that, we do keep doing that, and we do keep coming up with these things like that. We shouldn't allow the AI to say, assume that programmers are male and things like that. Just as like we wouldn't write it anymore. That there used to be a book called, there is still, it's a fantastic classic text, but it's called The Mythical Man Month, because the assumption was that programmers were men. And it's about programming. So now nobody would write, that would not be the title of anyone's book. And I'm not dissing that guy, he was a genius. It was just, that was the past. So we can make progress, but there isn't a perfect definition of fairness. But there's conferences, there's philosophers, there's lots of people working on this. And we're thinking about what would a fair society look like. and then whether or not it's appropriate to use technology to constrain our behavior to force us to be fair. Now that goes back to this question that we were talking about before about teaching. I personally would prefer to try to encourage society to be more fair, rather than to strap people into where they are not capable of doing unfair things. I think it's really important that morality comes from within, but at the same time, I'm in a relatively advantaged situation. So this is an enormous debate that is happening again on the world scale, and probably different countries will come to different conclusions, different regions, but the EU is doing a very nice job of trying to make this, and this comes back to fundamental rights.
Daniel, do you have an
I don't have anything
action to
add.
that?
I think that's,
Okay,
that's a great,
perfect.
great
Yeah, it's
answer,
a great
yeah.
explanation.
Thank you.
Cool. So I think, yeah, there was a lot of questions. So I don't think we're going to have the time because we're already 30 minutes after the initial time, which is great because, yeah, this discussion has been very interesting for me, and I hope for the audience too, and for you, the speakers. So we'll wrap it up here, and we're going to come back with a blog post about this conversation, and yeah, maybe get back to you to also continue the discussion of the questions that the audience had. But for sure, yeah, we had enough material maybe for several webinars here. So thank you all for attending us and being with us today. And thank you, Olivier, Joanna, and Daniel. It was a really great moment, and we learned a lot today. And we hope to see you very soon again. Sure. And thanks again also to the organizers of HEART webinars, Marine Chamoux and Miriam Bilak. They're our moderators of the live chat.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. It was great. Thank you.
See you all very soon.
Super interesting to meet you guys. I really enjoyed it.
Good love.
And I hope we'll be in touch.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.